Hey everyone, welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we are still continuing in Romans. We're in Romans 7. I think Romans 7 covers about 3 days. We were in it yesterday, in it today. And today we're going to be looking at God's law, how God's law reveals our sin and our sinfulness. And this comes from Romans 7, verses 7 through 13. And so, reading this real quick, it says, well, then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. I would never have known that coveting is wrong if the law had not said you must not covet. But sin used this to command to arouse all kinds of covetous desires within me. If there were no law, sin would not have this power. At one time, I lived without understanding the law, but when I learned the command not to covet, for instance, the power of sin came to life and I died. So I discovered that the law's commands, which were supposed to bring life, brought spiritual death instead. Sin took advantage of those commands and deceived me. It used the commands to kill me, but still the law itself is holy, and its commands are holy and right and good. But how can that be? Did the law, which is good, cause my death? Of course not. Sin used what was good to bring about my condemnation to death. So we can see how terrible sin really is. It uses God's good commands for its own evil purposes. And so, just to kind of look at this one real quick, it's like Paul starts this, he'll do these transitions and he'll say, like, well, then, right? And so, the reason he's saying well then here is he had just said some rather negative things about the law, right? And so now he's explaining how God's law is good in order to guard against the notion that it is evil itself, right? And so he doesn't want anyone to believe that the law is good. The law just exposes our sinfulness, right? And so he says in there that sin used this command. And the literal translation of this is sin took an opportunity through this command. The word opportunity here, it's a military term for a position seized in enemy territory that becomes a base of operation. So basically, it's saying, look, like sin set up camp in this position, right? And so, by expressing God's demands, the commandments stimulate rebellion in sinful human beings, right? I mean, it's just a human nature. You tell someone that not to do something, and they're going to do it. And so that's kind of how sin works a little bit. Like God gave us these commands that, hey, do not do these things, and it just stirs up that human desire, that human nature. It's like, oh, I'm going to do the things I'm told I can't do, right? And so the commandments of God became an occasion for sin to accomplish its deadly purposes. And like he talked about, we didn't know what sin was, right? How, like he talks about, how I know that coveting is wrong if no something's not there to tell me that coveting is wrong. And so once I know that coveting is wrong, that sinful desire builds up into me to do something that's wrong. And that's our human nature. And so Paul then goes on to talk about how sin would not have that power. Like the law, by clearly expressing God's will, makes people more accountable than they would be without it, right? If you don't know something's wrong, right, it's hard to be accountable for something that you don't know is wrong. And so, and we even have laws today that not all of them, right? But we do have leniency in the fact that if someone just didn't know, right? If you didn't know the law, or you were unsure about the law, right? Or you didn't know that was wrong, then typically, right, there's a little bit of leniency here. And so this is that saying that. But if you willfully knew that something's wrong and you do it anyways, right? You're going to be held accountable for that in a much more severe way. And so the law of Moses, it didn't solve Israel's sin problem. But what it did was it exposed it and exasperated it, right? And so, and this is always the effect of God's law by itself. It has on human beings, on our evil nature, our human nature, our sinful nature, right? That's the effect that the law has on us because of the way we are. We're rebellious in that, right? And so Paul then transitions and talks about how at one time I lived without understanding the law. And more than likely, what Paul is referring to here is his early childhood before he came to the understanding of the full demands of law. We, like in the church world, in the church community, you'll hear that called the age of accountability, right? That, most scholars and most people in the Christian world believe that children and even and people who are, young adults, right? I'll say young adults, children, let me put it that way. They're not, although they're born into a sinful state, right? And they're born, obviously we talked about this, the inheriting the seed of the sinfulness of Adam, right? That started with Adam. That there's this age of accountability, right? And so it's not until someone becomes of a certain age, and there's not some magic number or something. I think it's kind of like Paul here. So when they become, they receive an understanding of sin and that kind of thing, and who they are, and the need for salvation, right? A true understanding, not a little hint at it or a little bit of a grasp of it. But and so Paul, like he talks about that, he's like, I lived without understanding the law, and I think there's we see many people today who children who live without understanding the sinfulness, and the and what that is, and so, but then he says, but when I learned this command, right? When I learned the command, when he learned the law and he understood the law, Paul experienced with the law as he grew to maturity shows everyone's personal. This is everyone's personal experience. We do this as we grow. We begin to understand the sinful nature, to understand that thing, and we reach a point where, and again, I don't believe it's set. Like I don't think there's some magic number or like some magic age. I think it's it depends on the person, right? Um, where we get an understanding of it, and so but so what he says here is like with the law, we have a greater accountability to God, which brings the power of sin to life, and this results in greater judgment. And so the more we understand, the more this comes to life, right? The more we're judged, and the more we're held accountable, and the more we're responsible for. And I believe that if you see this, and I don't have time to dive into this, and maybe this is something we can study one day, right? If you look at it, there seems to be like there's going to be different degrees of punishment for those who do end up in hell, right? For those who just did not know, it seems like or had the ability, there seems like there's going to be some grace and mercy there. And again, I'm not going to get into all this because there's a lot of biblical stuff we could dive into there, but it's, for those who truly knew what evil was, and knew they were doing evil, then the punishment is going to be greater than those who didn't understand, or didn't quite have a knowledge there. And so again, I'm not going to go deep into that, but we see here that like, and he goes on to say which were supposed to bring life, right? The Old Testament promised a blessed and secure life to those who obey the law. However, human beings, right, since we inherit, from Adam, a strong desire and a tendency to sin, we're all going to sin, right? When God commands to, come to us, we don't naturally obey them. We resist them and disobey them. So instead of bringing life, instead of the law bringing life, the law only confirms and exposes our lost and helpless condition. And so it's like, well, then why did God bring the law? Well, God brought the law because we had to have the law. You can't hold someone accountable for sin if they don't have the law, right? And so as we, or the rules, or what we're so, and so we have to have that. And then the other side of that, I think more more important than anything, is we needed a law in order for something for Jesus to come and fulfill. And so that's where in the end life comes through, because Jesus comes and fulfills the law. And so that's where it becomes, where now we don't have to obey the law. We just talked about this yesterday, right? We don't have to obey the law and keep the law. We just need to put our faith in the person who fulfilled the law, which is Jesus. And so we need to have that change of heart that the law cannot provide. The law cannot provide a change of heart, but Jesus can, and the Holy Spirit can. And so that's where our salvation comes in, thankfully, because like Paul talks about here, the law reveals our sinful nature. It reveals our sinfulness by exposing it to us, right? The law comes along and says, hey, don't do these things. These things are sinful, and our sinful nature says, hey, I'm going to do these sinful things, and we would do them whether we had the law or not, but it exposes our sin in the sense that now we know they're sinful, and just like almost any child, any human, you tell them something's bad not to do it, they're going to go do it anyway. It's like, oh, I'm going to do it more, right? We don't need to do this. This sinfulness is not good. It's like, oh, I'm going to do it more. And so it's just our human nature. It's our sinful nature. And so Paul's showing how God's law exposes that. And luckily for us, unfortunate for us, we have Jesus who come along to fulfill that law for us. And so all we have to do is put our faith in him. So tomorrow we're going to look at struggling with sin and dive into that a little bit. We'll finish up by Romans 7, and then next week we'll get into 8 and keep on going. Again, like I said, we're going to be in this for a couple weeks, so I hope y'all are learning from these. I know these are a little bit harder, and each one of these I could dive into. I could probably just do a year-long study just on Romans, and have plenty of material. but it's just unfortunate we can't do it. And so I encourage you to find some good devos like in the Bible app and stuff like that. There's really good walkthroughs of Romans and some deep dives of Romans. And so I encourage you to if you really want to study Romans and really dive into Romans, use some of those. But I hope you're learning from them. I'm enjoying it. I learn from it every time we go through stuff like this. Every time I study, there's little things I pick up that I didn't see before, and so I enjoy that. I also encourage everyone to subscribe to the channel. If you haven't had a chance to subscribe, do that, because that you'll get these daily, and you can read along with us and study along with us. And I encourage you to comment, share, all those things. That if you have questions, all that kind of stuff. I even encourage debate, as long as it's Christ-like. Because again, we don't know everything. I don't know everything, and so I'm always interested in different points of view. That if I hit something and it's like, no, I don't agree with that, or I'm always interested in that kind of discussion as well. So as always, appreciate everyone who took the time to watch this, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.